me to study the effects of transitional justice on the main sections of divided society. The first chapter of the book, as I mentioned, is contextual. It maps the history of human rights abuses and injustices of the communist era. This chapter asks what human rights abuses and other injustices were committed, and whether people were coerced to commit them. I found no clear answers about individual agency or duress. Both were present. So in this kind of a finding, it's clearly opposing this kind of individualistic perspective that everybody is responsible, as well as this kind of a perspective that nothing can be done because it was a communist regime and the human rights violations were largely anonymous. So it is not like in that anecdote when the defendant says, the victim fell on my knife, and that happened about 20 times. Transitional justice, which is described in the second chapter, provides this socio-legal context. I provide kind of overview of the history of transitional justice, how they were approved and what was their scope. By transitional justice measures, I mean all formal and informal measures for dealing with the past. Formal measures were those which were regulated by law, and informal measures were practiced informally, such as the invitation of former political prisoners to schools to share their experiences with students. These are important measures. They are not legal measures, but they may affect victims who share the truth, have this platform to share the truth publicly with others. As I mentioned, the Czech Republic was a leader among the post-communist countries in dealing with the past, adopting more than 10 different measures of transitional justice, many of which were amended, broadened, or extended to other groups. And I classify these measures into 4 categories. Retributive measures, which include prosecutions and trials, lustration, condemnation, confiscation of property of the Communist Party, reparatory measures, including judicial rehabilitation, compensation, social acknowledgement, and truth sharing, revelatory measures, which include access to secret archives, new textbooks, exposure of secret collaborators, including wild lustration, and reconciliatory measures, which included apology by the Communist Party, only one and kind of insufficient, and individual level interactions between former adversaries. So the first substantive chapter, chapter 3, examines the victims of human rights violations. As you can see in the citation from my interview with late Antonín Huvar, a priest and a former political prisoner, in the narrative of many victims, history and historical events were intertwined with psychological categories, such as suffering and pain, and health categories, such as ulcer, cure, and healing. And of course, legal terms as justice and guilt, and religious concepts such as sin and curse. And this suggests that dealing with the past is a multifaceted concept. It's justice is not kind of a narrow legal category, but a broad socio-cultural entity. And we want to achieve justice, this type of interventions need to be taken into account, not limiting the scope to some kind of a legal justice, but to open up to broader interventions. In this chart, which presents the results of multivariate analysis of predictors of sociopolitical redress, which is conceptualized as the integration of a victim into society, and individual healing, which captures overcoming experiences of imprisonment. We can see in the upper chart, upper part of the chart above, there are positive predictors or correlates of these two dimensions of reparation of former political prisoners, and below are the negative predictors. And we can observe that sufficiency of financial compensation and return to previous profession facilitate both dimensions, sociopolitical redress and individual healing of victims. We can also observe, I can tell you actually, that financial compensation actually was the most important factor of reparation of victims. This was, I would say, super significant in this results, very robust, and it kind of runs against this type of notions which sometimes happen in transitional justice literature, that victims' rate, symbolic meanings are higher than the material reparations. Actually, here we can see it was the most significant predictor. Now, the second fascinating finding of this is that the dual effect of truth-telling, the public truth-telling, which was frequently facilitated via the media or with, via talks with students, etc., had a negative effect on sociopolitical redress, whereas private truth-telling had a positive effect on individual healing. So this is, I would say, fascinating finding for the literature on truth commissions, because it tells us, yes, it is important for the victims to share their experiences, but the private truth-telling is defined as sharing the truth with people who are close, who are relatives, who are friends, apart from the other ex-prisoners. So those who had this kind of opportunity to share and who shared this also reported the higher scores of individual healing. Those who went publicly with those true revelations reported negative scores of sociopolitical redress. We can also observe that interactions with outside world means, for example, integration with perpetrators and perpetrators being seen as arrogant towards them had a negative effect on their sociopolitical redress, and being suspected by neighbors had also a negative effect on both dimensions of reparation, redress, and healing. Finally, I would like to mention that satisfaction with democracy was correlated with sociopolitical redress, finding which is very interesting because essentially justice here is essentially understood as a political justice, and the reason for this is that there is a huge political dimension to the reparation of victims. The satisfaction with democracy really underscores this dimension. We realize who were the political prisoners. They were people who were prosecuted for their political opinions. They were political beings. So for this reason, the political dimension plays a very important role in their life. And so they may sacrifice for the sake of politics, and they take politics very, very personally. The fourth chapter, the second substantive chapter, deals with people in the opposing part of society, deals with former communists. After 1989, anti-communist rhetoric was quite common among the right-wing as well as center-right groups in the country. The rhetoric was not purely ideological, but had instrumental motives. It serves the center-right or the right-wing parties to discredit a party of former dissidents, many of whom were in 1968 reform communists. So the anti-communist rhetoric was further augmented with biological characteristics. Communism was portrayed not as a matter of opinion, but a physical feature, suggesting it is immutable. If somebody was a communist, once he was or she was a communist for life. So from a historical perspective, obviously it was not a smart move, because it preserved communism by those who claimed to oppose it. But it served the political purposes of scoring points in elections. The underlying strategy of the right was dismissing any possibility of a change of heart. Nevertheless, many of us know the exactly opposite citation. Who was not a communist at 20 was heartless, and who was one at 30 was brainless. The citation takes the change of opinion as a process of political socialization, as a process of political growing up. So the role of transitional justice in this growing up is the focus of this chapter. So in this chapter, the transformation of former party members is conceptualized as the internalization of human rights values. The transformation was examined on two dimensions: personal transformation of pre-1989 Communist Party members, and intergenerational transformation that refers to the breakdown in the transmission of the totalitarian ideology from parents to their offspring. And of course,